Interview with astronomer and university professor Luigi Smaldone, edited by Ciro Discepolo, published in the book Nuovo Trattato di Astrologia, Armenia Editore, Milan 2004, 709 pages. Can you give us your definition of science and knowledge? Unless you specify otherwise, I will provide brief answers. Knowledge. The body of knowledge acquired by humanity and by the individual. Science. The body of knowledge acquired by humanity and organized into a system incorporating criteria for guaranteeing and verifying its validity. It is essentially these criteria for guaranteeing and verifying that characterize science as a part of knowledge. Throughout the development of Western culture, two fundamental criteria of control and assurance can be found. The formal logical criterion, a set of non-contradictory, mutually compatible, and deducible from basic principles, can be considered scientific. The empirical or experimental criterion, knowledge is scientifically true if it is supported by observations made under perfectly defined and repeatable conditions. In this chapter, I am gathering the diverse opinions of scholars from different disciplines, so please don't be surprised if some questions seem strange or rhetorical. In the following list, could you tell us which disciplines or subjects, as we prefer to call them, taught at university should be classified as sciences in your opinion, and which should not? Physics, mathematics, astronomy, biology, medicine, sociology, philosophy, psychology, statistics 10, psychoanalysis 11, economics 12, communication sciences 13, political science 14. Literary criticism. The criterion is always the same. Acquired knowledge plus a control criterion and the union of this knowledge into a system. So from this perspective, I have no doubt. Physics, mathematics, astronomy, biology, and statistics can be considered sciences in their own right. For medicine, there are aspects that certainly should be considered science, those that primarily concern interaction at the molecular level, while the other part of medicine cannot be considered science, but rather knowledge, experience, and technology. The same can be said for sociology, philosophy, psychology, psychoanalysis, economics, communication sciences, political science, and literary criticism. These disciplines address completely different aspects of human life, but they do not, at least in my opinion, constitute science. What you say is very interesting, Professor, and I'd like to focus on one of the things you mentioned in particular, namely statistics. Now, as you know, a fundamental part of studies in sociology and psychology, for example, is based on statistics. In fact, I even asked a sociologist and a psychologist to interview them, asking the same questions, and according to them, the use of statistics could, so to speak, validate certain research conducted in sociology and psychology. Now, in my opinion, this is very important because it is the crux of the matter, at least of this part of the book I'm working on. That is, the question arises as to whether subjects like psychology or sociology, when they use tools like statistics, which according to your colleagues isn't even a science, can actually have scientific validity according to the standards you mentioned earlier. Wait, quantitative analysis is one thing, science is another. These are completely different aspects. Science means internal self-consistency, that is, an internal mathematical control rule or an empirical control accepted by the community, meaning the repeatability of results under controlled conditions. But this, both for psychology and sociology, is often lacking. Of course, more or less valid results can be obtained. 50%, more than 50%, but that doesn't mean, above all, which parameters are under control. Are all parameters under control? The big problem, as I was saying, even with much of medicine, is precisely this. There are an enormous number of factors. They are complex systems. Factors that can drastically influence the experiment and even determine the outcome. It's said that the movement of a butterfly in China can influence the climate in the West. Well, this is one of those cases in which minimal causes, overlooked or not controlled for, can completely invalidate the results. So, in essence, I don't want to force you to give a definitive answer. If you were to give a global assessment of psychology and sociology with the use of statistics, given the specifics you've just listed, what would you say? That we can, at least for some of their studies, count them among the sciences, or that we can never count them among the sciences we call exact? For me, science means, as I said before, not only knowledge, that is acquired knowledge within the domain of the community, but also a system of control. If it doesn't have a system of control, it's not a science. This is the principle, and these two disciplines don't have a system of control. For me, two mathematicians arguing over something on the border aren't arguing because they don't accept or recognize the truth, but because they don't recognize the truth of a thesis as a science until it's irrefutably demonstrated that it doesn't contradict a prior truth. There are still many contradictions in the example you gave. However, at this point, the reader, the man in the street, the ordinary citizen such as myself, might object that these subjects are always recognized within a strictly university context. That's not quite right. Engineering uses methods, the findings of other sciences, but it is not a science. There is no single criterion defined for building a building or designing an elevator. This is technology, and it is something different from science. Yes, but I wonder then what, for example, this knowledge of sociology and psychology is with the use of the precise canons of statistics. You teach me that the sample must be collected in a certain way, and that there must be no flaws in the sample collection. It's not a question of flaws in the sample collection. It's a question of understanding what a well-defined sample means, and therefore what a well-defined and repeatable experiment is. When it depends on a huge number of causes and uncontrollable variables, how can we say that if we put ourselves in certain conditions, we'll obtain a certain result? Of the two criteria, one is internally logical, non-contradiction. The other is empirical. In other words, if you construct the experiment in a certain way and find a certain type of result, that's fine with me. I'm speaking of the result in the statistical sense, meaning I'm fine with 63% of the result being of a certain type, another 15% being of a different type, and another 22% being of yet another type. In this case, the statement of the results can have scientific value. The problem is control, how the experiment is defined, how the experiment is controlled, and if there is no control, there is no scientific value, at least in my opinion. I understand your point perfectly, but excuse me for insisting, the question arises naturally. So, what do these professors who teach these subjects within the universities where these disciplines are taught? Literature? No, it's not literature, it's called human sciences. But in a completely different sense from science, where science normally refers to the study of relationships and the search for the more or less general rules that govern relationships. I understand your point perfectly. In fact, I've tried to the best of my knowledge, to delve deeper into the discussion we're having today, reading Popper and other authors, but I still wonder, to give a practical example, how to evaluate the murder case that occurred near Aosta, the case of Mrs. Fransoni, the mother alleged to have murdered her child. The court requested an expert opinion from psychologists and psychiatrists to determine whether this woman was capable of killing again and therefore dangerous to her other child. What do you think, in other words, is the answer these experts gave to the judges, without intending to accuse anyone or imply that it's science or literature in a derogatory sense, useful, or is it useless? Having established more or less general rules, I believe what they have somehow established is typical behavior, and behavior that deviates from typical behavior. In this sense, what is considered valid is predictable behavior. But there's a big difference between this and saying it's certainly like that, or it's certainly not like that. It's the same result that can be obtained with a certain type of medical treatment, because I and 80 other people can have a certain type of response, 30 other people have another, and then 15 others don't fit these responses at all. What causes this result? Well, if we can isolate and define the experiment in a repeatable way, then yes, it can be a useful result. Many medical treatments are highly effective, but in some cases they don't work. If they explain to me why they don't work, I'm satisfied. This isn't science in the general sense, and not because they don't use scientific methodologies, but because the discipline lacks the internal control that defines science. Many years ago, I had the pleasure and honor of interviewing Professor Raffaello Francini at his home in Vomero. He was a bit angry with those scientists, part of the group, of course, because one shouldn't tar everyone with the same brush, whom he called scientisti, or rather, in a somewhat polemical sense, scientifists. And he even said that they even pretend to make us burp and have sex scientifically. In this sense, in his opinion, there is a dichotomy within knowledge, within the palace, let's say, of science, of knowledge of the university, a dichotomy between scientists, or if we want to put it like Professor Franchini, between scientists and scientists on the one hand, and the so-called professors of the human sciences on the other. Well, he complained that there was a sort of abuse or attempted abuse on the part of scientists who would like, these are his words from the interview, to arrogate to themselves the right to establish within the field of knowledge the existence of first-class and second-class disciplines, in which some have the blue stamp, the so-called science ones, and others do not. He essentially asked himself who on earth, and by what right, can attach the sheriff's star to their jacket and establish which professors are second-class and those are first-class. I don't like this classification at all. It's not a question of second class or first class. One thing is predominant in a person's life. Another has major effects on social life. No, what you call the blue stamp is simply a certain type of pattern. So let's not call following a certain type of framework science. Let's call it a discipline of intervention based on a control system. We'll call another type of framework something else, but it's not a question of first rate or second rate. We founded an association of friends in Caserta that has now grown. It's called Academia Olympia, and we hold a seminar every month. We're currently holding a series of humanism meetings of the new Academia Olympia, in which we always try, when the topic is scientific, to place the human aspects at the center of those scientific arguments. When the topic is literary, however, we try to adopt a scientific management style. It's not a question of first rate or second rate. It simply means that those disciplines have a certain internal control system to ensure that the entire apparatus has self-consistency and is not contradictory. I'm talking about a control system whereby someone can say, if I do this experiment under these perfectly defined conditions, then I will obtain a certain result. Note that a certain result doesn't mean I find this number, but it could also be that this is achieved with a certain degree of probability. What you do achieve, however, is repeatability, meaning that wherever the experiment occurs, under those conditions, that result must be obtained. I'm not talking about a deterministic result, a precise value. It could also be a probabilistic result. What I find particularly stimulating among the many interesting things you said is the reference to medicine. In fact, in my experience, many people believe that medicine is a science, while I point out that doctors themselves have Ars Medica written on their graphic symbol, the caduceus. Now, this, in my opinion, does not speak against the subject, in the sense that it is true that an X-ray interpreted by 10 different doctors can be interpreted in different ways, but in this case, the artistic factor, so to speak, can constitute an added value, positively and not negatively, in the sense that it depends on the sensitivity of the individual doctor and their general knowledge. If that doctor has also cultivated interests in other fields, whether they can see in that X-ray some detail more or with a different meaning than their colleague. Therefore, in my opinion, you did not denigrate medicine when you said it is not a science. That is absolutely true. In the case you cited, everything depends on the experience of the doctor examining that X-ray. It is a very small signal, and for some doctors with little experience of certain pathologies and their developmental pathways, it has no importance, while for others it has a great deal of importance. It's knowledge, returning to what I said in my first answer. This seems to me to be a very important aspect because, as you know, some of your colleagues in the scientific world maintain, first and foremost, that medicine is a science, while in fact, as you explained, in this sense, it cannot be considered a science, even if it uses scientific instruments. Phenomena at the molecular level, those of molecular surgery and molecular interaction, are science. The other components are not, because they are highly complex and not perfectly controllable systems. There are thousands and thousands of variables, and so it's clear that one variable that isn't taken into account could invalidate the entire research system. Let's recall a physiopathological situation involving astronomy and medicine. In the 1940s and 1950s, the influence of the moon on menarche was hypothesized. Research was conducted, conflicting results were found, and it seemed to be a hypothesis without scientific basis. But then, not many years ago, the effect of synchronizing pheromones was discovered. It's clear that when a huge number of parameters are involved, their scientific evaluation becomes difficult, in the sense that the experiment becomes uncontrollable. Professor, one last question. Then I'll leave you to your valuable work. The opening couplet of this book, taken from a quote by Martin Heidegger in Letter on Humanism, is the following. Man in the atomic age could find himself dismayed and helpless at the mercy of the unstoppable supremacy of technology, and this will undoubtedly happen if man today fails to bring meditative thought into play against purely calculating thought in this decisive game. Would you like to comment on it for us? Completely agree. Calculating in this case means tinkering. That's what kids do. They don't read textbooks. They no longer use the system we used in the moment before thinking to try to find the simplest, most elegant solution because every attempt was extremely expensive. Currently, trying is much cheaper than thinking, but I can't predict where this change will lead us. There are colleagues, in fact, who believe we must be the ones to change. I'm speaking here as a teacher. Perhaps there isn't a single learning system, and in fact there never was a single learning system. Compared to a century ago, the school and teaching system has completely changed. Now perhaps new tools and technologies will force us to no longer follow linear learning through fundamental stages, but rather non-linear learning, jumping from one piece of knowledge to another. This also means that while we were used to doing only one thing at a given time, now we do many more things at once. We listen to music, study, communicate all at the same time. For some, this non-linear, multitasking approach may seem like a different way of learning. Today we understand the brain and its organization more deeply. For just over 100 years, we've been experimenting with a certain type of learning methodology. Perhaps there are other methodologies probably more effective, but this does not imply anything about science or knowledge. It is simply a different way of learning, and I am not saying that ours was the best.